I'm James Gardner, host of Your History, Your Story, a podcast for everybody who loves stories about interesting people and events told by those who uncovered them from within their own family trees. This, we hope, will inspire you to discover and celebrate your history and your story. In this episode of Your History, Your Story, we'll be speaking with Mike Purdy. Mike, who is a presidential historian, author, and media commentator, was a guest on a recent episode of ours titled Presidential Friendships, How They Changed History, Metastatic Prostate Cancer, and that he had just completed writing a book titled Reflections of an Uncertain Journey, in which he shares the impact the disease has had on his life. In this episode, we'll be speaking with Mike about his new book and the physical, emotional, spiritual, and relational journey that he has been on since his devastating diagnosis back in the spring of 2019. Mike will also tell of the importance of having family and friends who have helped to sustain and encourage him along the way. I'd now like to welcome Mike Purdy back to our show. Welcome, Mike.
Thank you for having me, James. Good to be here.
You are a return guest, and we're very pleased to have you back because we had a really terrific prior episode about presidential friendships. And I learned so much from that discussion with you about your book on presidential friendships. But when we were speaking, Mike, as you know, when we were getting to know each other to do that particular interview, we found out a lot of stuff about each other. And it turns out we have many things in common. We have a love for presidential history in general. We both went into a business career. You know, most of our regular career was in business, but that we have this deep interest in history that we've continued. We both attended seminary as well, so we found out we had that in common. And it turns out that the other thing that we have in common is that we've both had an encounter with prostate cancer. And during that conversation, you mentioned to me that you had written a book called Reflections of an Uncertain Journey. And you sent me that book, and I've read it, and I am truly touched and inspired by what you've done in that book. So I want to thank you for coming back to Your History, Your Story to talk about your reflections of an uncertain journey. So welcome back.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be back and to be talking about this book, which is very significant for me.
Yeah, and the way you formatted the book, it was organized in a way that we were able to, the reader is able to experience at some level the disease itself that afflicted you and how that impacted you physically. But it also touches on the emotional and faith journey and relationship journeys that you've had along the way. If you don't mind, Mike, I'd like to start by asking you to give us some of your background prior to your diagnosis. You've spoken in our previous episode about your love of history and things like that, but you've been a very healthy person most of your life, haven't you?
I have been incredibly healthy, which is, one of the things that makes this journey with prostate cancer so surprising, so shocking. I've always tried to take care of myself. Okay, so I like sugar and, I eat a lot of that. But, I've maintained a healthy weight my whole life, and that's been fairly easy for me to do. So, yeah, I'm an unlikely candidate for prostate cancer, especially being diagnosed with stage 4 prostate cancer, meaning that it's spread outside the prostate. And that was the first diagnosis, and that happened when I turned 65. So yeah, it's been very surprising to have that diagnosis given my otherwise great health.
Yeah, Mike, did you have any history in your family of prostate cancer?
No, not directly. There's a couple of very distant cousins that had it that I'm aware of. But other than that, no. I've, as I look at my family background, my concern has always been more about heart attacks and strokes. That's what a number of people passed away from. I've had really a blessed life in many ways because I've lived longer than most of my ancestors, both of my parents. My mom passed away at 58, my dad at 64. I've lived longer than all of my grandparents and most of my great-grandparents. And, I'm 68 now. And so they most of them lived relatively short lives.
Now, you're a historian, so you've done the research. You know about these people. You've looked into their lives, so you know a lot about them, including their health history, right?
Exactly. I mean, history has always fascinated me. So certainly when it comes to family history, that's something I have looked into. There's more I still want to research. Of course, there's always stuff to research when it comes to history. So yeah, history has always been part of my DNA, it seems like. That, I grew up from about the age of 8 to 10 years old in Princeton, New Jersey. And of course, that area just has so much rich history. And my dad would take my brother and I to visit historical sites over the weekends, where Washington crossed the Delaware, Nassau Hall on Princeton University campus, which at one point was the capital of the United States. And there's just tons of history. I was captivated by it. I read all of the biographies in the school library in Princeton. And of course, the presidential biographies with a focus. I had a picture of each president. The U.S. Treasury Department puts out these engraving pictures of the presidents. I had those posted on my bedroom wall in order and memorized the presidents in order. I could say the presidents in order in 10 seconds. Of course, now, so that was through Kennedy. And now when I say the presidents in order, I'm still on muscle memory through Kennedy. And then after that, I have to think about it. I have to reconstruct the history. So it probably takes me longer than 10 seconds to do from Johnson to the present than it does the first 35 presidents. So
You can still do what the vast majority of Americans can't do, I would imagine. I don't want to insult anybody, but it's not something that everybody knows how to do for sure. So knowing about your family history and being a history lover, don't you feel like you're a part of a bigger story?
absolutely. And that has been something that I have reflected on a lot in this prostate cancer journey and realizing that, okay, we are each here on this planet for really a short time. And so everybody has an impact of one sort or another. And it's a question, how do we live well in the years that we have here? And so it is a much bigger story. It's, everybody dies. This whole journey of prostate cancer is a real wake-up call for me about my own mortality. And I think before the diagnosis, I felt like every day was a new day and they were endless in front of me, and that I always would have another day. Realizing intellectually, of course, that that doesn't happen and that the end of our days eventually comes. But the prostate cancer has kind of jolted me and made me realize that, okay, my years are quickly narrowing, and what does that mean for me in terms of now? And how do I live well? How do I live fully? How do I live faithfully in the grand arc of human history?
Well said. Mike, let's start with your diagnosis. How did that happen? How did that impact you when you found out?
So it was in 2019, in the first couple of months of the year. And I started to feel, I was 65 then, I started to feel a number of things that I had not felt that were uncomfortable. Some pains in my upper legs, some constipation, some digestive issues. And initially I thought, this is because I'm in my mid-60s. These things happen. It'll go away pretty soon. Well, it didn't go away. And I thought, maybe I need to get this checked out because this seems like there might be something more going on, but I'm sure there's not something more going on and it's some easy thing to solve. So I went in to see my primary care physician, and he ran a PSA test. So PSA measures this prostate-specific antigen, measures the presence of prostate cancer, this antigen in the bloodstream, which is one of the best reflections we have of how much somebody has prostate cancer. And so my PSA was like 66. And so just by way of context, anything less than 4.5 is considered normal. So this was pretty far outside of normal. The doctor sent me in for a hernia exam, make sure there wasn't something else, scheduled another PSA test for the following month just to make sure it wasn't inflammation, which can also cause the PSA to reflect higher. Went in a month later, the PSA had gone from 66 to 77. I was scheduled for some scans, a CT scan and a bone scan. And when those results came back, those dreadful words were spoken to me that you have prostate cancer and it has spread outside of the prostate. So it is metastasized to the bones, to the pelvis, to the hips, and to the tailbone, sacrum area. So that was how I learned about it. The actual diagnosis in early May of 2019 was just a little more than a month after my 65th birthday. It was pretty depressing, especially when I learned about the statistics for longevity or lack of longevity, that 70% of the men with prostate cancer that's metastasized pass away within 5 years. So not a very promising statistic. So that's kind of how I initially found out about it.
And, looking at the dates that you just mentioned, this is right at the same time that COVID, was just brewing at this point. So that was just around the corner.
Exactly. And, it's been an interesting journey from that perspective, because at the same time, while I have been going through the prostate cancer treatments, including radiation and chemotherapy and things that suppress your immune system, we got COVID. And so it became a very isolating period in a number of ways. And I mean, COVID was and is isolating for all of us from a social perspective. So I was dealing with those kind of at the same time, and still am.
Yeah, it was right. Was it probably March of 2020 that we got impacted, and it had been less than a year since you had your diagnosis. So in your book, you talk about the emotional journey that you went through and are still going through. So when you first were given this news, how emotionally did that impact you?
Wow, a lot. I mean, it was depressing. It was scary. I think the overwhelming feeling, I mean, it's hard to put a finger on what's the most overwhelming emotion, but probably it would be sadness. And that I was just, and am just, incredibly sad that this has happened. And because I'm enjoying life and I enjoy people. So to find that may all end much sooner than I ever anticipated just brings me a lot of sadness and grief, a lot of tears. I think also there's another emotion that has been throughout this whole journey, has been feeling that this is so unfair, that given, as we talked about, my otherwise excellent health, I've asked the question, why me? Why now? And the unfairness and the sadness are things I still think about and wrestle with. There's this sense of despair. And there's also a sense emotionally where I'm very prone to do future tripping, where I think about all the bad things that can happen and when they might happen. And that can consume me. I'm trying to manage that better. I'm trying to realize that, okay, my task in this season of life is to live well. And it should be at any season in our lives to live well. But I guess I'm just especially more sensitive to that now and wanting to be faithful and doing the things that I feel called to. So, along the way, I've gotten help, in the emotional journey portion of the book. I talk about counseling and how that has been very helpful for me in dealing with some of these emotions.
That is so wonderful that you're able to articulate in the book how important an impact counseling was for you and how that helped you through that process, because you've got so many things going through your mind while at the same time loving life. You love life. You have so much to do. And I'm on Zoom with you right now. I see behind you a whole load of books. I'm sure you've read many of them and you got many more you want to read. You're a man who has loads of different interests, and you are and continue to make a huge impact in educational things, the history community, presidential history community, the books that you've written, and the books that you want to write still. So I know that you mentioned in your book how your sadness is that you want to keep living, you want to get all there is out of life, but you're dealing with difficult things. Now, you also mention how as you would move forward and start to really say, hey, I'm going to start living, I'm going to do things, that you had those scans and test results you had to wait for and get, and that would sort of drag you back a little bit. But you also talk about, and it's throughout the book, it weaves in and out throughout the book, is your faith journey, the whole spiritual component of dealing with this disease. Can you talk about your faith and the journey that you've had with this and prostate cancer?
Sure. I grew up in a home that was not faith-based at all. My mom had grown up in a household with a father who had a Catholic background and a mother who had a Jewish background. And my grandparents decided just to put those aside when they got married. And as a result, my mother grew up in a secular home. My dad, similar story, again, a very Jewish background with his parents and ancestors, but that was not a major part of his life. It wasn't a part of his life at all, really. And so that's the household that I grew up in. When I went away to college in the fall of 1972, I joined a fraternity, which is kind of uncharacteristic of me because I'm not a partying kind of guy. It wasn't. And yet that particular fraternity had a half dozen guys who were Christians who had a Bible study every morning, and they invited me to join them, which I did. And I found that as I began to read the Bible, I began to understand it more. I'd never really read it. And so my faith took root in college and has been a grounding force for me ever since then. That said, and we talked about earlier too, that, we both went to seminary. So I went to seminary with the idea of possibly becoming a pastor in a church. Ultimately, that's not the career path that I followed. So I've had this wonderful theological grounding in my life, but nothing quite prepared me for prostate cancer. That theological grounding and faith background has been important, but it's been a struggle, certainly. So my challenge has been, how do I take what I believe to be true, and how do I kind of look at where my journey is at? And this goes back to what we talked about earlier, that this is all part of the grand arc of human history, that we all are here for a short time. And so I can ask the question, why me? Why now? I could also say, why not me? Why not now? And so the theological background that I've had, my faith journey has been incredibly important. The prostate cancer journey has definitely stretched me and moved me into thinking perhaps more deeply about issues. And it's been a significant part of this journey. And it's not to say that there are not tensions there. There clearly are tensions that, when we end up facing our own mortality, that's a difficult thing to do. And so it's been a challenge. Let's put it that way. Yeah.
I think with faith, when we're up against trials, sometimes it's not a up and to the right or down and to the right. It's like a up and down, isn't it? Can you talk a little bit about how you manage that up and down?
Yeah. So I find myself praying a lot, praying for healing, which has not come, praying that somehow I would be exempt from this, that doesn't come. So that creates this whole host of some of the emotions that I talked about earlier. And ultimately, I have to come to the place of saying that, as the psalmist writes in the Old Testament, my times are in your hands, God. So the number of my days isn't something I control. And, recognizing that and trying to be faithful in the immediate moment and living in the immediate moment. I think there's a sense in which I could say in the last 3.5 years since the diagnosis, I have lived really fully. I've packed a lot in, and that's been good. And it's also good that there's this sense of being able to plan, being able to prepare. It's also painful having this stretch out, and especially when I feel physical discomfort and pain. So there are clearly the ups and the downs of it, and I'm resolved that I want to approach each day as fully as I can and do what I think I'm being called to in that day. I also want to try to live, and this is easier for me to say than to do, but I want to live without fear. And, I'm not afraid of dying. What I am afraid of is pain. So the nature of metastatic prostate cancer that goes to the bones is this excruciating pain. So in the summer of 2021, when my PSA skyrocketed, the pain also skyrocketed. And I could not sit. I could not be in any position without my body jerking around from the pain. It was just uncontrollable. I mean, fortunately, I talked to the doctors. I got on some pain medications that helped to bring that down. And then I went on targeted radiation that helped zap some of the cancer and control the pain. But I want to live without fear. But I do confess that I do not look forward to pain in the future. One of the things that I've thought about, and I write about this in the book, is that it seems to me in some way that pain brings new life. And so I compare that with a woman in childbirth who goes through excruciating pain, and yet that brings forth a new life. And I think it's the nature of human existence that somehow, for most people, not everybody, that pain will be a necessary component of them passing from this world to the next. Not everybody, of course, some people might die of an instant heart attack or an instant stroke or an accident. But for many of us, our bodies will simply deteriorate and we will experience pain. And I'm trying to figure out, how do I not live in fear of that and recognize that God is with me each step of the way, and that pain will ultimately result in a new form of life when I pass from this world.
Mike, first of all, you are such a brave person, and you are also such an honest person. Reading your book, I couldn't help but comment. I spoke to Kelly about this, my wife, Kelly. Your book is so sane. It's coming from a place of somebody who's so realistic about things, but it's somebody talking about how their faith is sort of at odds with this feeling of unfairness at the same time, that tension, trying to live in the moment and get all you can out of life because you love life. But then you get these darn scans and test results, and then you're worried about when they're going to be and what the results are going to be, and having that phone call or that email. You just take the reader through this journey of all those tensions, but yet you end up very consistent in the way you analyze things. About you keep applying your faith, you test it, it gets tested, but it's still there, and you keep moving forward. And it's written in a way that really brings the reader into a place where, whether it be a health crisis or an emotional crisis, you're challenging the reader to look at the present, look at today. How can you best live today? Now, we talked about the pandemic. Some of the unfortunate results from the pandemic are increased cases of anxiety, depression, and really a lot about, I suffer from anxiety myself. A lot about anxiety is fear of the future. And it may not be a diagnosis or a health incident or what have you. It could be a fear that you're going to lose a relationship, or you're not going to have enough money, or you made a bad decision, or somebody's upset with you, or you're not sure about something. We're always looking at the future. There's a fear there. But when I read your book, it could be applied to so many different things. I mean, you're so honest about wanting to live in the moment, and you've accomplished some amazing stuff while you're going through this. And yet you're maintaining that the best course is to live for today, but at the same time admit that you do struggle and you have to lean hard and heavy into your faith. But you also talk about relationships, people here, family and friends who have walked alongside of you throughout this process. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. So a couple of thoughts about that. I mean, one is the fact that I never wanted to write this book. Okay. I mean, it's just not something I'd rather write about presidential history. Okay. But I did it for two reasons. One is because I thought that in some way it might be a clarifying book for me. It might provide a framework for me to help live in the moment. But I also did it for other people. And you were talking a minute ago about how everybody faces uncertainties in life, whether that's a health challenge, financial concerns, relationship concerns, job concerns. I mean, life is not on a certain track. It's filled with uncertainty for all of us. And I wanted to take some of what I've been processing and provide that framework for other people to deal with their own sense of uncertainty. But one of the things that has been really significant for me is that I have not felt alone on this journey. I have been surrounded by so many dear friends who have walked with me on this. I've got some friends who I'm in contact with daily who want to know how I'm doing, who are empathetic, who are concerned about me. And then there's other friends who have popped into my life who maybe are new, and that they end up kind of rotating through my life. And it's just a delightful thing that that I have never felt alone from a friendship perspective, certainly there are times I feel alone when I'm waiting for a test result, when I'm in tears because of a test result or because of pain or because I'm doing future tripping about the uncertainty of it all and the unfairness of it all, the sadness of it all. So yes, there's a aloneness that I feel. We each end up having to deal with certain things on our own. But friends, as I called them in the book, my companions for the journey. And these are people who, whether they are, a close knit group of maybe around 10 or so folks who I know I can always call on, they're always there, or people in a wider sphere that pop in and out of my life and who I know are concerned and are praying for me and walking with me and crying with me. And it's just been a really delightful thing. And in one sense, I mean, I wish I did not have prostate cancer. But in one sense, I'd say that I'm not sure that these friendships would have deepened to the extent that they are if I didn't have prostate cancer, if I were healthy, that we would all just be going through our lives and no issues. And so the cancer diagnosis has brought me closer to people, and I'm really grateful for that.
Yes. You also talked about a 50th high school reunion where you met a bunch of people you hadn't seen in a long time. How was that experience for you? Because that wasn't that long ago you went, right?
No, it was just in July of 2022. It was something that I wanted to do. It was a goal that I had to make it down to Southern California from Seattle, where I live. I was very involved in high school and I knew a lot of people, and I've stayed in touch with some of them, but not everybody on a close level. But I wanted to go, I wanted to be there. So I drove down and I made it to the reunion. There's obviously the COVID concern and issue. I was one of, I think, 4 classmates who wore masks during the reunion. And that was fine. I didn't mind doing it because I really didn't want to get COVID. And, as it turned out, there were a couple of dozen people after the reunion who did come down with COVID. And of course, they're all people who I hugged and greeted. So I feel very fortunate that I escaped that. But it was very significant for me to see these people. But it was also very sobering for me to realize, especially as the time of that reunion weekend was winding down, that this would likely be the last time that I would see most, if not all, of these people in this lifetime. And that was, sobering. It was sad. So, but again, that's kind of the cycle of human existence. And we don't get to hold on to this life or to these relationships permanently here and now. We all will move on to the next grand adventure, whatever that may be. We can call it heaven. The fact is, none of us know with any certainty what that will look like, other than I can say, I think when we look at the nature of creation, the nature of life, what we know about the character of God, I think we can say that that will be good.
Yes, absolutely. The other thing that you stress is that there's a legacy that you've been thinking about. Of course, one of the main things you're focusing in on is the here and now, living today. And you are living well. You're living well in the day, and you're working hard. It's not that it's not a challenge for you, but you're also thinking about what's to come, but you try not to focus on the negatives. You're starting to think about the positives, about what kind of a legacy to leave. And you mentioned about legacy of lives, words, and possessions. Could you start by talking about legacy of lives?
Yeah. So the whole cancer journey has made me think a lot more about significance. What impact does my life have on others? And so I think about, okay, how do I invest in lives. I mean, it's a sobering thought to realize that within 2 or 3 generations, nobody will know Mike Purdy. Nobody will know James Gardner. But what they will know is the lives that we have invested into and how that helps shape other people who in turn can shape other lives and help other people to live their lives more fully and faithfully. So I realize that that is part of my legacy. It's a major part of it, that I want to be able to impact lives, whether that's friends or family. I've got a 6-year-old grandson, and how do I invest in him? And how does that carry forward into the future? So I try to invest in lives. I do spend, a lot of time talking with friends, emailing, texting, and it's good for me. And, but it's also hopefully good for them in terms of trying to help them through their own uncertainties in life. And it's a joy and a privilege to be able to do that.
Yeah. I start getting very reflective sometimes and start thinking about, well, I look at my age and I'm saying, well, all right, well, I'm not going to live to be 130. So there's a good chance, that I'm getting older here. I don't know how many days I could have till tomorrow. I could be here another 30 years. I don't know. But what about, 100 years from now? Sometimes you see an old statue somewhere, a monument to somebody, and you don't know who the person is. You got to Google them or what have you. And maybe you'll find something. And not to get depressing, but you think about many lives that, really you don't know anything about the person because it's been 2 or 3 generations. But when you can remember that somebody told you about how somebody impacted their life, something they did or said or wrote, which we'll talk about next, impacted a life. It could change a family tree, what the person did. It could change a generation of people. There can be insight given on different topics that survives and influences people educationally or spiritually in the future for the betterment of mankind. I mean, you start to think, I'd like to think that my grandkids will think back when they're my age and say, hey, they call me Baba. Baba made us laugh. Remember that? I hope it's something like that, something that'll last. And I think that's so important. But writing is so important. Now, you and I both love history. And one of my favorite books is John Adams by David McCullough. And John Adams and his son, John Quincy Adams, were well known for keeping detailed diaries of their lives and their thoughts, their inner thoughts, the people who pass through their lives, descriptions of people. How important is the legacy of words to you?
For me, it is so important. And this is where, I'm both blessed and hampered by the fact that I love history. Okay. So that I understand history, I enjoy it. And therefore I say, I want to leave this legacy of words, which will hopefully help future generations, however narrow or broad that scope is, to live their own lives with gratefulness and with a sense of clear perspective. And so there's lots of things that I have written. I've written 2 books about the presidents. I've written family history things in when was it, 2021? After a number of months, I published a 4-volume collection of selected writings of mine over my lifetime. I mean, it's a thick 2,600 pages, 4 volumes. Who's going to read this? Well, hopefully family, and I've given it to family members. I've given it to some close friends. And I guess I think about that and I think, wow, I would sure love to have that kind of information about my dad or my mom. I don't know whether that's just a natural human response or whether that's because I'm just so in love with history or not. But I think about that, and I think that that's a gift that I have created and given to a narrow slice of the world.
I think that's terrific. I think of my grandfather. I never met. He had passed away years before I was born, and my middle name is his first name, so I'm named after him. And I didn't know anything about him, very little. My father told me a few things. I learned a couple things. But then I found online newspapers, and my grandfather was very active in politics and different activities and clubs in town. And all of a sudden, these newspaper reporters were telling me stories. There were printed letters that he wrote in the newspaper. I was like a kid on Christmas going crazy. I was devouring any information I could find just to piece together a man who I didn't know because he was my grandfather. So the thoughts of assembling information about your thoughts, your life, it's like a treasure trove and this is true for anybody, keep a diary. First of all, I think anything I've heard from my faith community as well as, mental health community is keeping a diary and writing your thoughts is very healthy and very beneficial historically too for family members.
It is. And I mean, I've written a diary or journal I started in 1975. So however many years that is, 40 plus years. And there's sometimes that life got too busy and I didn't write in it. But I've got these nice bound lined books, I don't know, 25 of them or something. And it reflects what my thinking has been, what my feelings have been over time. I use it to help me process life. Now, those journals are not part of what I published in the what I call Grace in the Wilderness, these 4 volumes of my selected writings. I would still like to do that. I'd still like to transcribe those and print that in a different volume just because that's the only copy. And it's written in cursive, and many people today can't read cursive. And so that limits its accessibility some.
Now, wait a minute. I think you and I talked about this before. You're going to embark on a 6-volume set on the life of President James K. Polk. You promised me.
I wish, yes.
Wow. So the other thing you mentioned about legacy were possessions. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. So I think as I go through this season of life and I look around me in my house and I see things possessions, items that have significance to me, to my life, that bring back memories of things, that bring back stories. I think about, okay, what's going to happen to all of this stuff when I am gone? People don't know the stories behind them. They're going to say, this is just a bunch of, memorabilia. What do we do with it? People don't have space to store it. So it's kind of a conundrum. One of the things I've started doing is with some items, I have started sending significant things to friends. I've talked to my kids. I've got a daughter and a son. I've talked to them about specific things that they might be interested in. And, some of the things they say, yes, I would like that. And other times they say, no, why would I want that? I don't have space for it. And that kind of hurts a little bit, but I understand that. Part of me understands it. They're not historians like I am. So, I would say, what do you mean you don't want this? So, at any rate, it's a sobering thought, and it's one that makes me reflect on, okay, my life is more than my possessions, but my possessions do tell stories, and I love stories and I love history. So it's an ongoing thing that I'm still dealing with is what do I do with my stuff? And how do I have it find good homes, especially books? I got a lot of books in my house. I mean, I've got, I don't know, at one point, my daughter and I, when she was younger, we counted them, and I think I had like 4,000 books or something at that point. And so there's a lot of stuff to deal with.
I don't think you had as many as Thomas Jefferson had, did you?
No, what was his 25,000 or something that he sold to the Library of Congress? Yeah, right.
I think he went broke buying books over in France when he was over there.
He did. He could not resist. I can't resist.
Yeah. You know, the other thing about possessions we think about, they do bring back memories. I've got a lot of stuff in my attic that belonged to grandparents, great grandparents even, but there's lots of photographs. And we inherited, I was given a lot of photographs that are very old. Unfortunately, on my side of my family, my father's side of the family particularly, were notorious for this, not writing anything on the photograph. There's like no clue. So, but me, the brilliant historian, now I researched it and I know now who a lot of those people were because I asked a very elderly aunt. But do you think I actually archived it and wrote down who they were? I'm gonna get to it in retirement. Well, I've been retired. This is my this is my fourth year in retirement, and I'm getting to it. I'm getting to it.
I mean, one of the things is that I'm so aware of in this season is that we lose history so quickly. And your example of the photographs with nothing on the back of them, and they're just photographs, but you've figured out who they are. Now your task is to write that down. And I did a similar thing after my mom passed away. I inherited all of her memorabilia and photographs. Again, not a lot of things written on the back of them, but I was able to figure out a lot and piece together kind of part of her story that I never knew about before, and ended up writing a biography of her life based on what I could reconstruct through all those records, what I knew. Did a little piece on family history in the beginning of it, got court records, and a fun project to do.
Isn't that a blast? That is so fun.
Yeah.
So you talk about your journey ahead. Now, let me ask you this, if you don't mind. Where do you stand with your treatments? I understand you're going to be moving on to a new set of treatments soon. How are you feeling now, and what are the plans to continue to battle this disease?
Yeah, great question. So I have, as part of this journey, I have had what's called hormone therapy, both injections, which I still continue to get monthly. I've been on a couple of oral medications that I'm not on now, and the purpose of those is to suppress the production of testosterone, which is the main food for the cancer to grow on. I've done targeted radiation. I've been on chemotherapy for 16 months. And just last week, so this would be in February 2023, I had some additional scans, a CT scan and a bone scan, and it was kind of a mixed report. It showed that the cancer has grown in a couple of areas of my upper spine and in my rib, but the other areas where it primarily was initially, in the pelvis, in the hips, and the tailbone, was stable or had actually shrunk. So a mixed bag, but in talking with my doctor, decided, and I reluctantly agree, that the chemo is not working anymore. So in early March, I will be going onto a new treatment. It goes by a number of different names, Pluvicto or PSMA. And what it is, it's a radioactive infusion that they've designed it so it just targets a membrane that is part of the cancerous cells, and the radiation targets just those cells to kill the cancer there. It'll be 6 treatments, 6 weeks apart. This is the last major treatment available. There's a couple of other things out there, possibilities, but I'm kind of getting toward the end of the line right now in terms of what's there to keep the cancer at bay. I'm hoping and praying there will be new treatments developed or perhaps even a cure for metastatic prostate cancer. There is no cure for it now. So, you know, I do what I can. I do have to confess that it has been a very tough emotional time for me to realize that I'm moving on to the last major treatment. That's been really hard on me. So that's kind of where I'm at. Physically, right now, I'm feeling relatively okay. I do notice the increase discomfort, sometimes pain, and bone pain caused by metastatic prostate cancer is pretty excruciating. And as we talked about earlier, I dread that pain. But for right now, and it's a day by day kind of thing, right now it's quite tolerable. I'm still totally functional. I still walk 3 to 4 to 5 miles a day. So the journey continues, you know.
I think one of the blessings is that you did have so many years of great health, and there's got to be some benefit to that in the strength and stamina that you've had to withstand a lot of the treatments that you've had, right?
Exactly. And, you know, I have been blessed, I feel like, during this journey that I have certainly there have been side effects to the drugs and the chemo and the radiation, but I feel like I've tolerated them fairly well compared to what other men have had to suffer through. And it's, you know, every time before I would get chemo, I do blood tests. And, you know, my blood test results are really fairly strong. There's certainly things that are outside of the normal range, but they're fairly strong. A lot of that I attribute to some alternative medical treatments. I've been seeing a naturopath for most of this time since diagnosis. Same thing about going to acupuncture every week for almost 3 years. And those have really helped me, I think, to be able to tolerate some of the rigors of the different treatments.
After I put the book down and I was reflecting upon it, I don't mind telling you, I got a little emotional several times during it because you were just approaching your faith and your life, your emotions, your relationship with people in general, and this passion of yours for history and writing and you're so bravely and sincerely facing this disease and expressing those feelings on paper, because I think a lot of people don't know what to make of it. They might go through a real situation where they don't know how to articulate what they're feeling. And it sounds like in the best way that you could. And by the way, I want to pause for a second. You're an amazing writer. I'm not just trying to flatter you. Your writing is beautiful, so fluid as it was in the book on presidential friendships. You're just a natural writer. Actually, you give away in your book that you were, about 8 years old when you wrote your first story. Unfortunately, the title was misspelled. And you haven't made a mistake since. But you're a wonderful writer. The way you articulate your thoughts and your faith and your heart is just amazing. But I also was trying to think, okay, how can I sum up what I got out of your book? And I came across a quote from you right near the end, and it said, "We cannot change the length of our lives, but we can change its width, depth, and the positive impact we have in this world." And I just think it speaks volumes as to not only how we can interact with others and seek help from other human beings, people, friends, and relationships that we have, but also what we can give back even when we're in pain. And you give back so much more than so many people do, including myself, on a normal, everyday, feeling fine day. You give so much back, and it's so appreciated. And you also wrote at the end of the book, "May God grant us the wisdom and grace to live well, love deeply, and laugh heartily, even as we experience the unknown that confronts all of us." Mike, I know we haven't known each other that long, but I consider you a good friend. I feel like we're kindred spirits. I've just been so blessed to be able to speak with you and get to know you.
Thank you for those very kind words. I do appreciate it. I totally agree about the friendship with you. It makes it easy doing this too, because as we talked about, we have found one another as good friends. It's easy to talk with a good friend. So, and if I'm anything, I think I am a writer. And so this was something that I felt I needed to do, is to write about this journey. And I'm glad to hear your response to what you read. And, writing is how I kind of process life and figure out, what do I think? What do I feel? And so that's what I've tried to do in the book, is to kind of give people a window into what it's been like going through this very uncertain journey. And, the uncertainty is, what treatment will work? When does the pain hit? When do I pass away? When am I not functional because of pain? There's just this whole host of uncertainty, but it doesn't have to be, as we've talked about, uncertainty about health. We all face lots of uncertainties in life. And I just think it's helpful to have a higher level view of what life is about. And, really, in one sense, we should all be living every day from the very beginning, knowing that our days are limited and making decisions based on that. And, I've gone through most of my life and have not done that. But now I kind of go, okay, this is staring me in the face, and I need to adapt and to change and to think about my mental frame of reference. And so I hope we can do that for other people as well.
Well, thank you, Mike. This has been a really inspirational chat. I know it's a tough subject. It's a difficult subject. And I know you're very courageous to be able to, A, write a book about it, but B, also try to articulate it on this podcast and tell people about your journey. And it's a journey that I encourage people to read about. We all face something like it at some point in our life, whatever it may be. And as we said before, it could be an emotional thing that has nothing to do with a physical disease, but nevertheless impactful on us and our lives and how we relate to other people. But I want to ask, what's your next project? You got to have a project.
Great question. After 2022, where I did a lot of writing, including this book, Reflections of an Uncertain Journey, and published the Presidential Friendships, How They Changed History book. I also did a book on what my career had been about, government construction contracting. I find that I'm a little bit burned out on writing and not having the energy right now to write it. So I'm giving myself a little bit of space. I'm just kind of trying to catch up on some things in life, trying to do some end of life planning kinds of issues, because I need to get those out of the way so that I can not think that I've got those hanging over my head the whole time, and so that I can launch into something else. So I don't know what the next big project is, whether it's another set of presidential friendships, or I've got dozens of ideas of books that I've thought about over the years that I want to write. And so I'm just spending some time right now thinking about that.
Well, Mike, thank you so much again for your time and for your heart and sharing your heart on your history, your story. And I thank you. And I hope to be interviewing you on another one of your books. Quickly, bring us back before you wrote Presidential Friendships. Tell us about the other book on the presidents you wrote.
Yeah, I wrote a book called 101 Presidential Insults, What They Really Thought About Each Other and What It Means to Us.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's this fascinating little collection of barbs that our presidents have lobbed at one another, either before they became president, during their presidency, after their presidency. Some of them were very private comments that, we now know about. Some were very public comments. And it just gives us a window into the competition, oftentimes, between these men and, their disdain for one another. And it's a fascinating little collection. And one of the things I wanted to do with it is I wanted to make sure that this was more than just a collection of these quotes, but I provided the historical context very briefly for each quote and the date when it happened and whether it was a letter or a tweet or whatever it was. Interestingly, in doing the research for the book, there were some really great juicy quotes that I had to leave out because I could not find the original source to back up that it was really real. And maybe it is, and I just didn't find it. But so I tried to make it that this was a well-documented book. And then beyond that, as the subtitle reflects, what does this mean to us? So in the introduction to the book, I talk about the need for civility, not just in the public square, but in our private lives. And how is it that we can treat one another with respect and dignity and civility, and that is really important. We're obviously in a new age, and there are, the level of vitriol has just ramped up over the last number of years, and I think that's very unfortunate, and that we need to remember that it is relationships that drive the course of human events, and we need to kind of back off on some of the biting comments that people make. And I know everybody would agree with that, but I just want it to be a thoughtful piece from that perspective. And, but also it's laugh aloud funny reading these quotes. It's sad reading these quotes, but kind of a fun little book.
Well, I'm going to get a copy of it and read it because I heard also that you wrote that somebody dispensed copies of the book to Congress?
Yes. I have a friend from college who has a private philanthropic foundation, and he was so impressed with the book, mainly the introduction with the call for civility, that he purchased books for every member of Congress and all 50 governors. And the foundation did all the logistics of sending them out. I wrote a letter, and my friend took that letter and included it with a copy of each of the books. And so that went out to all members of Congress and all governors.
Well, tremendous. I don't want to talk more about it because that's for the next time.
Right.
Mike, thank you so much. And I hope you have a great day.
Thank you. Thanks for having me here, James. And thanks for the opportunity to do this and to get the word out. It's, nothing else. I really want people to be helped on their own journeys. So thank you.
Great, Mike. Okay. God bless.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Your History, Your Story. You can connect with us on Facebook and YouTube at Your History, Your Story, or on Instagram and Twitter at yhys podcast. We'd love to hear from you if you have any questions, comments, or a story to tell. Be well and God bless.